Nasser is not a person. He is a unique historical phenomenon. It is impossible to consider any Arab issue without also considering this phenomenon and its impact upon it. His presence imposes itself on every problem, event, party, movement, government, and battle in the Arab world. It is a giant, oppressive presence which has inserted itself both negatively and positively on modern Arab history, affecting its course profoundly, sending forth currents that have shaken the foundations of all that preceded it. Munif al-Razzaz and Tagrib al-Murra, the bitter experience. Welcome to episode 40 of Tahrir Podcast. It is the 30th of May, 2024, and my guest today is Alex Rowell. Rowell is a journalist, writer, and online editor at New Lines magazine. He has authored 2 books, the first being Vintage Humor, the Islamic Wine Poetry of Abu Nawas, and the most recent being We Are Your Soldiers, How Gamal Abdel Nasser Remade the Arab World, published by Norton and Company, which we'll be discussing today. We'll also be discussing the parallels that could be made with contemporary times, so make sure to stick around till the end. Rowell, welcome to Tahrir Podcast. We finally meet.
Thank you so much. Yes, at long last. Great to be here.
Of course, welcome. I think your book does a great job of putting into perspective how Nasser's shadow, and more than his shadow, really, could be seen in the backdrop of when many brutal regimes throughout the Arab world were establishing their contemporary political systems. And the book examines Nasser's legacy not only in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, and Libya, but also in Egypt. So could you first start by telling the story of how the idea of the book came to be and how your research process was like?
Yeah, sure. So I was a journalist based in Lebanon for 11 years, from 2012 until just a few months ago, shortly after the recent attacks of October 7. And obviously the major event being covered at that time and in the background and foreground at all times was the Arab Spring protests that were then, when I was starting out in Beirut, still very much in their heyday. And in my opinion, still cast a shadow over events to this day. So, of course, one was always reading about, as much as one could, on Arab politics, Arab history, the various regimes which were taking the headlines of the day. And as I did so, just couldn't help fail to notice that in almost every case, be it Assad in Syria, Gaddafi in Libya, most obviously Mubarak in Egypt, but also slightly older regimes like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, it just struck me immediately that all the roads seemed to trace back to Gamal Abdel Nasser if you just looked a few decades back in history. And yet, it was also strange to me that this argument, although I would hear this argument in conversations with people, everyone sort of knew it. But there didn't seem to be a book that you could read that would just tell you that story in plain ways and with clear details, showing how the threads all kind of link together. So, they say, write the book that you would like to read yourself. So that's essentially what I did. That's, if you like, the sort of general background context. Slightly more specifically, I was at the house in Lebanon of a man named Malik Rowell, who I mentioned in the book, I interviewed for the book, and he is the son of a famous journalist in Lebanon in the 1950s and 60s, Gamal Rowell, founder of Al Hayat newspaper, founder also of Lebanon's Daily Star, which was the flagship English language newspaper in Beirut all the way from the 1950s until it closed, sadly, just a few years ago. Founder also of a French newspaper in Lebanon, and really, in his heyday, one of the major media personalities of the whole Arab world. And he was assassinated in 1966 by his family believes, and plenty of evidence points to the Egyptian Mukhabarat and its agents in Beirut were the actors behind Rowell's assassination. And I was just hanging out actually at Malik's house one evening, and we must have been discussing Syria or whatever sort of Arab Spring event of the day was the topic. And, he just kind of sighed and said, well, of course I would ask him also about his father, interested to hear more about that personal story. And he sort of sighed and said, well, obviously all of this begins with Nasser. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment. I thought, okay, so yeah, because I've thought that too. So in a way, he credits himself justifiably, I think, with giving me the spark for the book. And I was very lucky that he and his brothers have actually spent decades undertaking their own journalistic, investigative research into the crime of, their father's assassination, have done, really backbreaking, amazing labor in amassing documents and doing dozens, scores of interviews, including with the man who actually pulled the trigger and killed their father. And so they, very kindly basically put all their decades of research at my disposal. Some of it has been most of it has been published in Arabic before, but not really at any length in English. So I was very fortunate to benefit from their work and to bring it to an English reading audience for, I think it's fair to say, the first time, at least at this much length.
And in the book, you early on describe how Nasser and his fellow putschists were staunchly Egypt first and did not necessarily subscribe to Arab nationalism as a driving force of the revolt against the Egyptian monarchy in 1952. So can you describe what you think were the key factors and the consequences of Nasser shifting his attention to the region and not just the internal affairs of Egypt?
It's a really fascinating question, isn't it? And it's one that I still don't think I have a perfect answer to, and I'm not sure that anyone does. And I mean, as part of my research, I was putting the question to experts like Professor Sharif Yunus of Helwan University, probably the world's foremost authority and historian of Nasserism and Nasserist ideology. And, he gave me his answer, which was a strong one. But even I sort of felt I detected, he admitted it was a bit of a mystery. Because as you say, these people, the three officers, Nasser and his comrades, were essentially Egyptian nationalists first and foremost. They were not zealous ideological fanatics who were imbibing the works of people like Michel Aflaq or Sati al-Husri, the classic, real, true-believing Arab nationalists. In their youth, they were reading more people like Mustafa Kamil, Lutfi Sayyid, the classic people who were concerned with the affairs of the Nile Valley, first and foremost. And if you look at things like the so-called Al-Mabadi' al-Sitta, the six principles of the coup or the revolution when it first happened, all six were exclusively domestic in scope. There was no bullet point about, we must establish a single Arab state from Min al-Muhit ila al-Khalij, from the ocean to the sea, to the Gulf. But there was obviously the shift that took place around 1955, so about 3 years into Nasser's rule, where Arab nationalism began to supplant Egyptian nationalism. And it is always something of a mystery why that should be the case. It was perfectly possible for Nasser. By 1954, he was in very firm control of Egypt. Not just his regime, but him personally. He was established as the al-Rais, the boss, if you like. No one was seriously challenging his authority. If they did, they were in prison. He could very well have just contented himself with that, governed Egyptian affairs, and left other countries more or less to do as they pleased. But he very much did not do that. And you started to have Sawt al-Arab, the famous radio station, the voice of the Arabs, broadcast from Cairo, just flooding across the entire Arab region, inciting against a leader here, backing someone else over there, interfering very nakedly and flagrantly in the affairs of other states in a way that was, I think, very shocking to people at the time, very unusual. That was not the way that politics had really been done in the Arab world before. This was a much more kind of almost like a Leninist fanaticism rather than the genteel etiquette of the majlis. And you can imagine how the kind of traditional Arab way of doing business, you just didn't do that kind of thing. So, that's my long-winded introduction of the answer. To actually address the question, even before the Nasser era, even in the days of the Wafd, in the monarchical era, there had been this kind of rivalry for primacy in the Arab world between Egypt and Iraq, particularly the Iraq of Nouri Said. And so then, in a way, this precedes Abdel Nasser and the three officers. But it did very much take a renewed stress and emphasis during what was known as the Baghdad Pact saga. This was the first kind of great inter-Arab conflagration of Nasser's period. We don't need to get into details, perhaps, of what the Baghdad Pact was. Essentially, it was Britain trying to create a kind of a NATO for the Arab world, a club of British allied friendly states that would actually link NATO via Turkey all the way to Sito in Asia, all the way to the gates of China, frankly, through Pakistan, via Iraq and Iran, and I think, did I catch it? Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, and that sort of creates this unbroken chain. Looks very impressive on a map, but a solid wall of British alliances that would check Soviet expansionism to the north and kind of cement British influence in the Middle East at a time when, it was pretty clear, or should have been pretty clear to everyone, that it was crumbling. It was on its last legs in the sort of the general context of post-World War II, just the collapse of empire. Perhaps Anthony Eden failed to see it, but it was clear enough to other people. And so Nasser came out very vocally against this Baghdad Pact, and any state that wanted to join this was betraying the Arab cause, was selling out Palestine, was, all of this kind of thing. And in a way, this was just a way to have a dig at Iraq, I feel, because Iraq was in fact, the only Arab state that was actually a member of the Baghdad Pact. And one of the ways in which so there was this battle, if you like, battle lines drawn in the Arab world. Nasser's Egypt versus Nouri's Iraq. How do you win that battle? Well, the keystone state, it must have appeared, was Syria. Syria lies at a very strategic place geographically. It borders Iraq on the one hand, it's not too far from Egypt on the other. It links, it's got NATO's Turkey on the one hand, it's got Israel in there. The link between the desert and the Mediterranean, all kind of signs, or at least the thinking at the time was, he who wins Syria wins the battle for Arab opinion. And Syria, of course, is renowned as the beating heart of Arabism in its time. It actually is the home of Michel Aflaq and these kind of, the Ba'ath Party, of course. So, long story short, the answer that Sharif Yunus gave me, and which I guess is the most persuasive I've heard, was that in order to win Syria to his side, he had to make a pretense of Arab nationalism, which, of course, he must have, at some level, believed in, just not as a prime motivating kind of worldview ideology. And then, having discovered that worked, he just kind of stuck with it. Why would you not stick with what succeeds? And so he then took Arab nationalism to its logical extent, if you will, and ended up actually unifying with Syria in 1958, which perhaps we'll get into later on in the discussion. But that was, that did not end happily for all parties concerned.
And before I get to the next question, I'd love to ask you a question about how consequential was it, the failure to bring Iraq into the UAR, the United Arab Republic, fold? How consequential do you think that was to Nasser and his project?
Post-coup Iraq.
Post, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it was definitely a huge blow to his prestige on the one hand, and to the very project of the United Arab Republic, which was the name given to the Union state between Egypt and Syria. And of course, it was envisaged at some point, at least in theory, that other states should join this until it becomes a single Arab superstate. And the moment when Iraq had its own free officers coup 1958, very much mimicking the Egyptian example of 1952. And almost to a man, the members of the Iraqi junta that seized power were for the union, for the idea of just immediately joining the union. Why, of course, why would you not? Why would you do the coup if that wasn't the goal? But there was just one problem. The man at the very top, Abdel Nasser, who became the prime minister of Iraq, did not like the idea, it turns out. It seems, having discovered that he held the keys to Iraq in his hand, he actually didn't want to hand them over to Abdel Nasser, who lives very far away. Well, this is when you start to see that the divisions in the Arab world are not entirely false and superficial and just creations of colonialism. There are actual real distinctions between the regions. Anyway, that's maybe a separate discussion. So I think it was a big blow for Nasser, because this meant that, hold on, so you can do a revolution in the term of the day. You can be radical, you can be nationalist, you can be very anti-British and all of that. Establish ties with the Soviet Union, with People's Republic of China and all that kind of thing, do land reform, tick all of the boxes that Nasser's Egypt had done and that were popular with the masses, if you like. But you could do that on your own terms and not have to join Abdel Nasser's personal project. So that was, that he didn't like that at all, because what if that sent a message that there's trouble in paradise, apparently, and there are alternatives available. You can still be nationalist and radical and so on. You don't have to be a Nasserist per se. And this led to a lot of, a direct clash between Nasser and Qasim, several attempted coups in Iraq, an assassination attempt against Qasim carried out by, among other people, Saddam Hussein. And it's still not entirely clear how much involvement Nasser had in that. It's one of the questions I get into in the book, of course. What's for certain is that Saddam was then given asylum in Nasser's Cairo for more than 3 years. So, yeah, this was, certainly very destructive for Iraq. It's one of the main parts of the process that gets you from the coup of 1958 to Saddam Hussein ultimately taking power in, officially 1979, but in practice, well before that.
And what role did the physical space of Cairo play in regional politics during that period?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's one of the fascinating discoveries that I made during the book, that there was it's astonishing to reflect there was a point in history when all three of Gamal Abdel Nasser, Saddam Hussein, and Hafez al-Assad of Syria, future long-time dictator of Syria, were living in the same city, in Nasser's Cairo, from about 1960 to 1963, give or take. Saddam, as I mentioned, on the run from trying to assassinate Prime Minister Qasim in Iraq. Hafez al-Assad's situation was different. He was an Air Force pilot in what had been the Syrian Air Force, which then became the Air Force of the United Arab Republic. So if you will, he's actually in Nasser's Air Force at this point. And because he was known to be a Ba'athist, and because Nasser destructed Ba'athist just as he destructed members of all political parties, let's not forget, upon taking power in 1952, the regime bans all political parties in Egypt, shuts down parliament. We haven't got into that yet, but just does a whole scale across the board, shut down on civil and political liberties of all kinds. And so because when Egypt unites with Syria, they couldn't be two different political systems. It was a single state. So Syria had to adopt the system that already existed in Egypt, which meant it had to lose all of its political parties, lose its parliament as well. Syria had been actually a very vibrant, flourishing, if still flawed, democracy, parliamentary democracy before joining the Union in 1958. A point that's often lost, and I think really, really important to emphasize when we think about just how much potential the countries of the region had and how much was lost by the embrace of Nasserism, by the influence of Nasser. So because Assad is known to be a Ba'athist, military pretexts, but in actual fact, I think the regime just wanted to keep a closer look at what they were getting up to. And ironically enough, despite that, it was actually in Nasser's Cairo that the nucleus of what then later became the Syrian dictatorship was actually formed because Hafez al-Assad and the other Ba'athists are very angry about what's happened. They feel that the civilian leadership of the Ba'ath Party, people like Michel Aflaq, have sold the cause down the river. They shouldn't have agreed to disband the party. So, tactlessly, everything that's been worked for has been destroyed. So they began to work independently of the civilian leadership of the Ba'ath Party, meeting in places like Grumpy Cafe in Cairo, in one another's homes. Sometimes I think they would just drive out into the middle of nowhere and hold their meetings off the roads kind of thing. But this is where the conspiracy was born. They called themselves the Military Committee, I believe. And shortly enough, they went back, after the Union collapsed in 1961, they end up back in Syria, and lo and behold, by March 1963, they have launched their coup, and Assad is then on the way to power himself in Syria. 1 month earlier, February 1963, the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, in league with the Nasserists, it must be said, has done its coup So both Saddam and Hafez are on their way to power, having briefly lived all at the same time in Nasser's capital.
Yeah, and now that you've mentioned it, so I think we need to go back a little bit and talk about how Nasser effectively dismantled what was left of, dismantled Egypt's democratic institutions, which is the model that he later exported abroad and supported. So let's start by talking about that, especially the March revolt, which you talk about in the book.
Absolutely. A really, really crucial episode in history that I wish was better known. Perhaps it is still well known, at least among, Egyptian history buffs and politicos, but I don't think it's very well known outside of Egypt. Yeah, I mean, they took power in July 52, and by about September, a couple of months later, they began the crackdown on the political class, starting with the Wafd Party, which, you can call them, don't know how you want to categorize them, conservative, centrist, liberal, something in that kind of spectrum. But certainly not Islamists, certainly not fanatics. So it is very interesting that he went after what I regard kind of as a liberal centrist capitalist party, first and foremost. And that's for a very good reason, because they were the largest party in parliament. They were still, for all their flaws, undoubted flaws, they were still probably the most popular political party in Egypt at the time. So they represented the biggest threat. At the same time, he also goes after the godless communists, who are a well-organized force, if smaller than the Wafd, certainly. So it's very interesting, given Nasser's later reputation, especially among secularists who like to romanticize him as the kind of the arch-secularist who, smashed the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamism with an iron fist. Well, yes, I suppose in a way he did, but it's very interesting that he went after the liberals and the atheists long before going after the Brotherhood. It was not until more than a year later, in fact, that he moves against the Brotherhood for tactical reasons, not so much anything else. And then to January 1953, I don't want to go too much into the weeds here, but it is a very crucial month, because January 1953, they encountered a problem, you see. They arrested this kind of who's who of the Ancien regime, people like Fuad Sirajuddin, one of the main men of the Wafd, other major Wafdist and other figures. But because the Egyptian constitution at the time, still the same one from the pre-1952 era, was actually a very quite liberal, forward-thinking, democratic constitution. You cannot just hold people indefinitely in detention for no reason, which is what they were doing. I mean, it was political arrests. So they were obliged by December or January to let these people go. So how do they resolve this issue? Well, they came up with the idea of a revolution. Until then, it was not actually termed a revolution. Initially, July 23, 1952, is known as just the movement, al-Haraka, or Harakat al-Jaysh, the army movement. Nobody had used the word revolution. Revolution came into being in 1953 because this was the means by which they could get around this problem of constitutionality, legitimacy, accountability. Because ultimately, by definition, a revolutionary is not bound by the laws of the system that he overthrows. So by announcing the revolution, and then all of a sudden their junta becomes known as the Revolutionary Command Council, Majlis Qiyad al-Thawra. Mohammed Naguib, who was the kind of figurehead president at the time, becomes Qa'id al-Thawra. All this sort of terminology starts to come out. And because by doing so, they could say, well, there is no longer any authority higher than us. We are, it's a revolution. There's whatever came before doesn't matter. And this was a lesson that was not lost on people, for example, Iraq and Yemen, who later on did their own coups, Gaddafi, who drew the lesson from that, well, we should better call our coups revolutions from day one and just, move straight to that square. Again, January 1953, the political parties demand a 3-year transition period, so-called, is announced. Parliament is gone at this point. So this is now the move where the slide toward authoritarianism is very seriously gaining pace. That proceeds throughout 1953 until the end of 1953, when a very important event happens, which is the clash finally arrives with the Muslim Brotherhood. Until then, the Muslim Brotherhood had been on side. They had been given cabinet seats in Naguib's first cabinet. They had been given quite a high degree of influence. For example, it's maybe a might seem a small example, but it tells you a lot about, how the situation was. Cairo University's June elections took place, and the Wafd won, naturally. But because the regime couldn't allow that, they arrested the Wafd students and allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to win it instead, just as naked as that. But so that tells you a lot about how they were on side with the Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood at the same time was offering support for all the various moves that the officers were doing. Anyway, personality clash happens between Nasser and the Supreme Guide, Murshid Ali, Hassan al-Hudaydi, at the time. Essentially, it's a power struggle. I mean, the Brotherhood felt that they deserved some kind of stake in the new regime. In fact, maybe at their most deluded, they thought that they would supply the political and ideological platform, with the officers merely being the muscle that would enforce the program. So something that the Ba'ath Party in Syria also made the mistake of deluding itself that it could do a few years later. In actual fact, as both discovered to their cost, Abdel Nasser does not do power sharing of that kind. So the clash happens. And once it does, Nasser and the officers have managed to make enemies of basically every political force in the country. The Wafd, the left, the Islamists, everyone who matters and has weight, the intelligentsia, the journalists, the judges, the trade unions, feminists, students, you name it. Everyone who is into politics has been pissed off at this stage. And so the stage is set for this grand confrontation of March, really February and March of 1954, which, I mean, when you read the accounts of that, it's hard not to get vibes of 2011, and feel that this is almost like an Arab Spring avant la lettre, or a January 2011 situation. Definitely a precursor of it. And it's a complicated story. Maybe, we don't need to go into every detail of it, but essentially all those forces joined up, and there was an uprising, street demonstrations, outside the Abdin Palace. They were calling for Abdel Nasser to be arrested, things like that. Editorials are being written in the newspapers, very famously. Ihsan Abdul Quddus had been singing an essay against the secret society that ruled Egypt, which of course he's later arrested for. And initially the officers don't know what to do, but they buy time. They say, okay, we're going to allow parliamentary elections. We're going to dissolve ourselves. We'll go back to democracy. But at the very same time, they have these goons, which they call the Liberation Rally, or Hayat Tahrir. Very much like I suppose in 2011 terms, you'd call the Falul, or, in Syria, we're known as the Shabiha. Every regime has to have these, right? So the thugs who go around and beat people up. So they arrange these ludicrous demonstrations by the Hayat Tahrir, where they actually chant no to democracy, down with freedom, تسقط الحرية, stuff like that, لا أحزاب ولا حرية تسقط الحرية, stuff like that. I mean, plainly absurd. But they also commit acts of quite shocking and stunning violence. For example, the top judge in the entire country, Abdel Nasser Remade, a very famous legal mind, famous well beyond Egypt's borders, probably the greatest Arab juridical mind of his generation, was beaten to within an inch of his life by these thugs. Had a member of the RCC, the Majlis, not intervened, he probably would have been killed. And they were setting off bombs around town. One exploded at Gropi, one exploded on Cairo University campus. So, buying off trade unions also to host their own kind of, again, bogus demonstrations. So by this combination of carrot and stick, intimidation, violence, and bribery, they managed to extinguish this, what had been, I think, for a while, a very dangerous revolt, particularly as it had also reached the barracks of the army, which is where real power resides in this regime, as in the other regimes that later came after. The people you really have to worry about are the officers, not the students and feminists and whatnot. There had been a kind of some serious unrest in February 1954 among a faction within the army who had seemingly, had been pro-Naguib, essentially. In many ways, I know I'm racing through this very quickly, but in many ways the clash had been between Naguib and Nasser, or at least that was the pretext that the opposition used to kind of, that was the cannonball with which they wanted to sink the regime's ship. And Nasser had to go in person down to the barracks, and I think it took him several days to, calm people down and then arrest them. That was, as always, is the way that it went. And even after March, well into April and May, there were other arrests, follow-up arrests being made within, to really purge this army unit of its conspirators, to the extent that British intelligence at the time actually judged that the military fighting capabilities of this unit in Yemen, which was a crucial unit, had actually been, materially degraded by the sheer number of arrests that had been that have taken place. So that is really a very key moment. Another key moment in 1954 is the assassination attempt against him in October in Alexandria by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's really these twin events that make 1954 such a kind of watershed year, because it's after that Nasser responds by just concentrating far much more power in his own personal hands, not only in the hands of the regime and the officers, but in himself personally. It's at this stage that he becomes prime minister, for one thing, which, prior to then, the Majlis Thawra, the council of officers, had in theory been a council of equals, taking decisions by vote, by consensus kind of thing. That changes once Nasser becomes prime minister. He's now the boss, and the other officers are his cabinet ministers. Sure, they can advise, and their advice might be appreciated, but it's no longer binding. And soon enough, they're going to find that when he walks into the room, they're obliged to stand up. Imagine this is your friend of 20 years or something. All of a sudden, you have to call it a boss and stand when he enters the room, that kind of thing. And we also see the personality cult really play into the wider public and in the media stage. He starts ordering all papers to have his photo on page one instead of Muhammad Naguib or anyone else. He starts to bring in figures like Kulthum, the very famous singer. She is obliged to sing a song about the assassination attempt. Ya Gamal ya Misal al-Wataniya, Binagatak Yom al-Manshiyya. So singing a song to in celebration of his survival of the assassination attempt, which was later used in prison as an instrument of torture. Those who didn't sing the song would get beaten. And so really by the end of 1954, the political winter has set in, I think, and Nasser is now ready for long-term dictatorial rule. And really, you could argue, aside from the brief interruption that followed 2011, that has been, the case ever since, to this day.
And you outline a wide range of interventions carried out by Nasser, most notably in Yemen, which he called his own Vietnam, alluding to the American invasion of Vietnam. Do you see these steps as strategic, that they were necessary to securing particular goals, or were they personal vendettas and product of his ego? Or are policy and personality inseparable in the case of Nasser?
Well, yeah, it would be hard to regard them as strategic, at least not as strategically advisable, given how many of them ended so poorly. In the case of Yemen, I think he really needed a win, was the thing, because in 1962, Yemeni free officers, again, it all starts to sound very familiar. It's always free officers launch a coup. This is what happened in Yemen in 1962. They declare a republic, again, along the what were by then the familiar Nasserist lines, and they explicitly, requested help from Egypt straight away. In fact, that shouldn't be surprising, because they had already been colluding to some uncertain extent with the Egyptian intelligence mukhabarat in the lead up to the coup. It definitely did not come as a total surprise to Abdel Nasser. One of the people at the core of the Yemeni movement was the brother-in-law Anwar Sadat, for example. And you have to look at the context of that time, that moment in 1962. Don't forget, the union with Syria has collapsed the year before, 1961. A huge blow. That's the signature foreign policy achievement of Nasser's whole rule now lies in ruins. The very viability of the idea of Arab nationalism, of Arab unity, is now being called into question like never before. You still have Qasim ruling Iraq, who is hostile to Nasser. You have King Hussein in Jordan, who at this point is a mortal foe. of Nasser. You have Saudi Arabia, which is not really on side. So he's surrounded, and in Syria itself, after the Union collapsed, you had what he contemptuously referred to as the secessionist regime, infisali. In actual fact, just a democratic Syrian nationalist kind of, not Qawmi, Wathani nationalist government in Syria. So he sees himself as beset by enemies, beset by failures, and he needs a win. So what better news could there be than all of a sudden, wow, on the Arabian Peninsula of all places, this movement of opposites has just sprung up, done a coup, called for my help. There's various strategic considerations for why he would want to support this as well. It's on the Arabian Peninsula, which means that it's on the doorstep of Saudi Arabia, one of his great rivals. It's also Britain still has a so-called protectorate in Aden or Aden in southern Yemen. So there are many ways in which this could be beneficial for him. Also having mastery of the Red Sea, already from Suez Canal down to the Bab al-Mandab on the Yemeni terrain, would offer obvious strategic and tactical advantages, not least the ability to blockade Israel in the event that should become necessary. So yeah, on the one hand, it's emotional and it's clutching at opportunity as they arise, but also there is some kind of sound, I suppose, strategic rationale for why that would be attractive to him. But I mean, it very quickly goes wrong for a number of reasons. One is that he thinks the coup is a clean success and that the Imam, the previous ruler of Yemen, has been killed on the day of the coup. In actual fact, a few weeks later, it transpires the Imam is alive. He managed to flee somehow the capital to the north, his sort of tribal heartland, and he's rallied this very determined and surprisingly capable, militarily capable tribal resistance to the Republican coup, which then becomes the Yemeni civil war that rages for many years. And I think, in retrospect, Nasser should probably have called it a day in that moment and said something like, "Oh, I refuse that Arab weapons be turned on Arab people," which he had said the year before in Syria when he briefly flirted with the idea of crushing the Syrian secession coup by force. He was very quickly dissuaded from that. So he could have done the same thing in Yemen, but I think by that point he was too pot committed, as they say in poker terms. He had invested too much prestige in the new Yemeni regime. He'd signed, defense treaties with them or things like that. He was committed legally even to its defense. So he got dragged in, much to his own and most obviously, first and foremost, to Yemeni's great cost. And this, if I may just say, just another word on Yemen. I mean, this is really one of the things that, one of the motivations that pushed me to write about this book was how I felt so many of the misdeeds, even that is the euphemism, so many of the very dark, sinister acts that Nasser's regime committed are so poorly known, are almost unknown, at least certainly in the West among English language readers. They're better known certainly in the Arab world. And at the top of that list has to be Yemen. I mean, 20,000 people killed by most estimates, some 800 of them by chemical weapons. Very few people realize Nasser was the first Arab leader to use chemical weapons on the battlefield, long before Bashar al-Assad and Saddam Hussein. He was in fact he was the first leader anywhere in the world since World War II to use chemical weapons in a military context. Only the second man after Italy's Mussolini. I just felt things like this should be better known. They should be taken into more consideration in the general conversation about Abdel Nasser, who is, even if has always been criticized to a certain degree, I don't think that people quite grasp the gravity and severity of many of the acts for which he was responsible. And Yemen should be at the top of any accounting of that kind of thing.
And while reflecting on the book, I was struck by the idea that these very political systems Nasser either directly or indirectly inspired are the same ones people revolted against during the Arab Spring. And so the point could be made that to be in favor of democracy and dignity and the Arab Spring and the people really is to be anti-Nasser, for he was one reason among many that facilitated the region's rapid and nascent descent into brutal authoritarianism and the dismantlement of democratic institutions. And so how strong do you think that connection is?
Well, certainly it was very obvious to Libyans in Benghazi, for instance. In 2012, there was an incident which you can just look up on YouTube. There's a video of it. There was this huge statue of Nasser in a square in Benghazi that had been erected in the 1970s by Gaddafi. Gaddafi, of course, a huge admirer of Nasser, really idolized him ever since childhood. And so built all these kind of monuments to him, named streets after him, named airports, you name it. And so, yeah, this is in Gamal Abdel Nasser Square on Gamal Abdel Nasser Street. The street parallel to it is called 23 July Street, again in honor of the Egyptian coup. And the day came in, I think February it was, 2012, so Gaddafi has been killed by this point. A crowd gathered in this square, and they brought a huge kind of construction digger, one of those, giant machines. And a guy takes the microphone and says, this is the man who told Gaddafi, you are the custodian of Arab nationalism, al-Amin ala al-Qawmiyya al-Arabiyya, which is from a speech Nasser gave in 1970. And, there must be no more symbols and visible signs of the tyrants, either Gaddafi or Nasser. And so they demolished the statue, and then everyone got up and cheered and took photos and kind of, applauded. So certainly they were in no doubt that Nasser was linked to the despot, the tyrant who had agonized them. And I would argue, I would appreciate your input here. You would know this better than me, but in Egypt, it seems it can cut both ways. I mean, there were certainly those in 2011 in Tahrir Square who regarded Nasser as, if you like, the founder of the regime, of which Mubarak's was an extension. I mean, there's a quote that I use in the book where a man tells, I think it was the Guardian correspondent, with tears in his eyes, my parents protested against this regime in 1968. This regime, of course, being Nasser's, alluding to the famous student protests in Cairo University in February 1968. And today we finished the job for them. So for that person, at least, it was clear. By toppling Mubarak, you were bringing an end, as he saw it at the time, to the July regime. Others, I don't doubt, also, it's also been documented that there were those who raised Nasser's pictures on the revolutionary side as well. And the slogans, Irfa' Ra'sak Inta Masri, that's a Nasser slogan. So clearly there were those who also saw Nasser as somehow the spirit of Nasser being on the side of freedom, on the side of dignity, national pride. So it's a bit less clear cut. But then, of course, also in 2013, during the Tamarrud protests and everything that followed the coup, Nasser's portrait was held up side by side with General Sisi's, so very much identified with what you could call the counter-revolution. So, well, exactly. There you go. So, there are many ways in which the symbolism of Nasser can be repurposed, repackaged, put to almost any use. But certainly there are no shortage of examples of people who clearly identified that Nasser was responsible, whether directly or indirectly, as you say, for this club of tyrannies that had just brought such agony on their societies for so many decades.
I mean, most certainly, and if not in Egypt, in Syria and elsewhere. And one character that caught my attention in your book is Colonel or General Abdel Sarraj of Syria, who could be basically dubbed the father of Syria's brutal torture tactics and enshrining these brutal ways of torture.
He is a very fascinating character, yeah, no doubt.
Definitely. And is also could you talk about him a little bit? And also how his fate was, how it ended?
Of course. Yeah. Sarraj is a truly infamous character. One of the worst in the whole kind of cast of characters in this book. He was the head of something known as Al-Maktab al-Thani, or Le Deuxième Bureau, to use the French colonial term that was still in use in Syria in those days. Basically means military intelligence. And he had been a powerful man before the union with Egypt in 1958. But it was when that union then took place that Nasser made him, in effect, interior minister of the Syrian province, to use the terminology, right? Al-Iqlim al-Shmali, the northern province, as Syria became, the country no longer technically existing, which gave him a tremendous amount of power, obviously. It put all the levers of police force, as well as really was ingenious in methods of torture that he invented, many of them still used to this day by Assad's torture state, essentially created the foundations upon which Assad then built his later torture state. And I talk at some length in the book about a particular case which is, very chilling and disturbing, that of a man named Farajal al-Hilal, who was a leader of the Lebanese Communist Party going back to the 1940s, really quite a prominent figure in his day. And as we said earlier, when the union took place, all political parties had to be banned in Syria, as they already were in Egypt, which meant the Communist Party. And the communists were quite a tough bunch. They had been through, this wasn't their first rodeo, as it were, when it came to oppressive regimes. They had spent many years in jail. They were used to this kind of thing. They weren't going to go quietly into Nasser's good night. The head of the Syrian Communist Party, Khalid Bakdash, famously said, "No communist party has ever dissolved itself," and very swiftly exiled himself to Eastern Europe to escape what would have been a nasty fate. Well, that fate came to Farajal al-Hilal, the party went underground, and he was tasked with being one of its veterans, with running the underground illegal communist cells that still existed and operated in Syria. And he was Lebanese and based in Lebanon, but would make the trip back and forth across the border, very extremely dangerous thing to do, to coordinate those activities. One day in 1959, he does it, but Sarraj's agency, the Deuxième Bureau, has already, by this point, turned a number of his comrades into informants, and so they know to expect him. They're waiting at the safe house in Damascus. They catch him when he comes, and he is subjected to a night of very unpleasant torture, and we know the details because an actual Syrian, after the secession happened in 1961, a Syrian court actually investigated the evidence. They made arrests. They took testimony from people who were eyewitnesses. So we know the details quite reliably. And these were given to me by the man's daughter, Farajal al-Hilal. I managed to track down his daughter in Lebanon, a woman called Nada al-Hilal. She very kindly gave me all the documentation that she had in her possession. So again, like with Rowell, this is one of the, if I say so myself, one of the strengths, I think, of my book is that I was able to get this kind of very neglected, little-known testimony, bring it to an English reading audience that probably would never have heard of it before. Anyway, Hello is killed within 12 hours of being taken into custody. But that's not the gruesome part. The gruesome part is they had to dispose of the body because this couldn't be allowed to come out. Right? Hello is a household name in Lebanon and Syria at the time. Nasser does not need this scandal, especially that he's in negotiations with the Soviet Union at the time, trying to get funding for his grand Aswan Eye Dam project, one of his signature infrastructure projects, which he cannot finance by himself. It turns out the revenues from the Suez Canal, which he nationalized, are not going to suffice, not nearly going to suffice to cover this very expensive project. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anyone following Egyptian affairs today. So he needs the Soviet Union on side. He cannot have it get out that he has just killed the leader of the Communist Party. So at first they bury him in a very amateur fashion in this shallow grave outside Damascus. And then a couple of weeks later, they decide that that's not going to do. Eventually some farmer is going to rip on the body and this is going to come to light. So Sarraj, one of Sarraj's men in the bureau, is given the very unenviable task of having to go and secure a bathtub from the old souks of Damascus. Cover the plug hole with cement, dig up the body, cut it into pieces, pour acid into the bath, pour the pieces of the body into the bath, put a wooden door on the top and leave it for a few days. And again, this is all the testimony that he gives, the man himself, Waji al-Antaqli, I believe is his name. he later gives to a judge in Syria. And he inspects the solution a few days later and is amazed to find that even the bones have dissolved. I don't want to get into too graphic detail, but and then they pour it into a ditch outside the man's house. And this has kind of really entered Syrian public imagination, at least among Syrians of a certain older generation, as kind of just, a byword for absolute horror. How could it not? And funny enough, nowadays, if you think about it, has echoes of the Jamal Khashoggi assassination, murder, and the way they disposed of his body. Another echo of Nasser many decades down the line. So that's the kind of thing that I did. And he was jailed, actually, after the coup, the secession coup in 1961, the one that ended the Union. And he might well have lived the rest of his life in jail had it not been that Nasser managed to approve an operation to sneak him out of jail using various actors. A Jordanian Nasserist was one of them, and crucially, the Lebanese authorities. At this point, Lebanon is ruled by President and General Fahd Shahab, a man who is quite popular to this day in his country. Another figure who I think who has some slightly undeserved popularity. I wanted in the book to kind of just chip away a bit at his reputation. And this story is definitely, I think, one example of that. Because Shihab approved the operation to have Sarraj freed from his cell in Mestre prison in Damascus, then brought to the Lebanese border. I believe it was on camels or mules or something. They crossed the rocky border terrain and ended up at the house of Gamal Jumblat, father of Walid Jumblat, the prominent Druze politician in Lebanon. He spends the night in Gamal Jumblat's custody, as his guest, rather. And then the very next day is driven from Beirut to Beirut airport by members of the Lebanese Maktab al-Thani. Same name, different agency, but same role, the military intelligence. All wearing Lebanese army uniforms. Sami Sharaf, who was one of Nasser's closest aides, bragged to a Lebanese interviewer in, I think, 2007 or something, that he still had the Lebanese army uniform in his closet in Cairo. And so with full knowledge and connivance of the Lebanese authorities, Sarraj gets whisked away. A hole is cut in the fence of the airport. He goes straight to an Egyptian plane, whisks him away to Cairo, where he then lived for decades as a free man, a fugitive from justice, a guest of the Egyptian authorities, never facing any accountability for the many crimes. And again, I've already listed the tip of the iceberg. He was also responsible for assassinating the Prime Minister of Jordan, Naser and Arab, in 1960. And, someone whose relatives I was able to track down. I flew to Amman as part of my research and met his son, General Hussein al-Majali, a very interesting character in his own right, a former interior minister, a former head of the Royal Guard under King Hussein. He told me everything that he knew about his father's case, another case that is almost unheard of to this day. Who outside of certain circles in Jordan even knows that the Jordanian prime minister was blown up by the Nasser regime?
And you also emphasized the role that Nasser's Egypt played in regional developments and coups such as the Iraqi Free Officers Revolt, the war in Yemen, assassinations, etc. And in a region of numerous coups carried out by various actors, why do you think Nasser doesn't often come up in the discussion of regional instability like the US, Israel, Iran, and Russia?
Yeah, I mean, this gets really to the core, in a way, of my purpose in writing the book, is that there does seem to be a kind of exception made for Nasser. Everyone now, especially after the Arab Spring, will concede that, okay, Saddam Hussein, bad guy. Hafez and Bashar al-Assad, bad dudes. Gaddafi, crazy despot kind of thing. But then there's always seems to be, or very often seems to be, a line drawn at Gamal Abdel Nasser. No, come on, he was different. He was kan adami, kan kwayis, zalama. You hear this a lot, even to this day. I don't know quite why it is. I think it must just be the force of its personality, the charisma, the propaganda that was, very expertly done at the time. And maybe there's a kernel of truth to it. Maybe he was, he clearly was not a genocidal mass murderer to the extent that someone like Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad were and are. So in a way, it was a slightly gentler era in politics, but we cannot ignore the way in which he bears, I think, the historical responsibility for so many of those regimes coming into power in the first place. As for why, you'd have to ask his defenders why they continue to excuse him. I certainly argue that we should not. We should cease making that Nasser exception.
Definitely. And earlier, you mentioned the 1953 and what was happening and how revolutionary terminology was brought in. And it made me think of, back then it seems that the rule of law in 1953 Egypt was way stronger than it is in 2024 Egypt. Using this revolutionary terminology to kind of have some kind of legitimacy, whereas now it's not even close, such as like the pre-trial detention conundrum in Egypt right now. So if you're on pre-trial detention, you basically, as per the constitution, you can only be imprisoned on pre-trial detention for 2 years. But there are individuals that have exceeded this period, and not even exceeded this period by, a couple of months, by 2 years, 3 years. So I think this puts that into perspective.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, and that shouldn't be surprising if you consider that the regime today is still an extension and descendant or inheritor of the Nasser regime. That's perfectly logical.
Are there parallels to be drawn between Nasser's Egypt and Iran's regional role? Because Iran seems to be doing the same thing Nasser did decades ago, although on a smaller scale and a different approach and a weaker leadership. But the core idea seems to be fairly similar. So what do you think?
It's an interesting hypothesis, and I hadn't heard it before. But yes, I mean, I see the parallels that one could draw, the idea of sort of exporting the revolution. Also, in the Lebanese context, I mean, I'm sorry, I have to bring things back to Lebanon because it's the country that I know best. I lived there for 11 years. I often thought when writing the book that the role of Egypt in Lebanon in the 50s and 60s, ultimately, really up till the mid-70s, was analogous to the role that Assad Syria then later played in the 80s and 90s up until basically 2005, that, the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri and the uprising that followed, which ended up with the exit of the Syrian army from Lebanon, at which point Iran then became, if you like, the main external regional hegemon dominating affairs in Lebanon. So to that extent, yes, Iran, at least for the Lebanese, is in many ways what Nasser was in the 1950s and 60s, and what Hafez and later Bashar al-Assad had been in the intervening decades. Of course, in Yemen, there's an irony there because Iran today backs the Houthis, who are, if you like, kind of descendants of what in Nasser's day were known as the royalists, the pro-Imam tribal Zaidi forces, who are actually the ones fighting Abdel Nasser. So it's an irony. It's one that's been pointed out by Hazem Salih and others in the articles that isn't it amazing how the universe sort of flips? Yesterday, reactionaries and imperialist blackies and Ramadan Unions are today's spearhead of the resistance and the ultimate defenders of the Palestinian cause, referring to the Houthis, of course. And Saudi Arabia is now, which had been on the side of the pro-Imam royalist forces against Nasser, is now flipped and is in the position that Nasser now is, fighting for what were then called the Republican forces against the northern tribes. So it's just some historical irony there.
You make a compelling case for connecting the Middle East's political trajectory to Nasser's political regional ambitions. So if you were to write another book centering another figure, who would it be?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I actually am in the early stages of researching and hoping to write another book, one that will be complementary to this book. I think there will be a logical sort of coherence, but not centering on a single figure per se. So I'm sort of weaseling out of your question there. So, but it's hard when you're in the frame of mind of planning one book to suddenly imagine, what if I was writing an entirely separate book? Yeah, maybe I'll have to answer that question in a few years when the next book is out the way. But I'm not sure that there is any figure quite like Nasser in modern Arab history, really. Definitely the most popular of modern Arab history. Probably the most consequential. I mean, no one else has had that kind of impact in so many countries. Of course, there are people who had more impact in their own country. People like Hafiz al-Assad, let's say, in Syria, Gaddafi in Libya. But on the whole, on the regional scale, I can't think of anyone who is as worthy of study.
1 second, let me just wait for that tram.
Is that the Cairo Alexandria line?
No, that's the tram. It's not a train. It's like the slow tram.
I enjoyed taking the Cairo Alexandria train a few years ago. Last time I was there.
Did you use the bathroom?
I don't think so.
Because you would have noticed that it's like it just, there's no drainage system, it just goes out.
Well, like you said, it did feel like it probably literally was a Soviet era garage or something, very much the same one that Nasser would have.
Yeah. And the last question is, where do you see the lessons learned from Nasser in the region today, as well as his lasting legacy?
Well, that question, I suppose, presumes that the lessons have been learned. I'm not so sure that they have been learned. But if you mean what lessons should be learned, I mean, I make no pretense to be a policymaker. I think, like most writers, I'm better at saying what doesn't work rather than what does. But at the very least, we should be able to conclude with quite high confidence that what does not work is extremely repressive military dictatorship. Unfortunately, that lesson does not seem to have been very well learned, not only in the countries we've been speaking of, but places like Sudan, which is obviously a huge mess and a huge tragedy right now, the world's largest displacement crisis by some measures. It's easy to lose sight of the fact that this began, at least in the more recent terms, as a conflict between civil and military forces. The challenge of power sharing between civilian and military obviously was not successfully navigated, and we're living with the after effects of that today. So, it would be nice if people would just, for once and all, abandon the idea of military rule, dictatorial rule, authoritarianism in general. Unfortunately, it has an enduring appeal, not only in the region, but I think in the West, if not for the Western public, not for domestic politics, but in terms of how the West formulates its foreign policy. There's still this very fashionable idea that, the way to handle the Middle East is just let the strong men rule. Democracy doesn't work. I mean, I actually heard this recently. I gave a talk in London about the book and spoke very much sort of similar points to what we've been saying today. And someone came up to me afterward and they said, you know what? Good job and everything. I agree with everything you said, except for one point where you said that, that something about democracy, we should all aspire for democracy for the Arab region. He said, no, it's never going to work. They're just not ready for it. The same kind of colonial era talking points that people have been saying for 100 years. People still believe this. That was a British person saying it, an otherwise quite normal, liberal-minded person, but just fundamentally does not think that democracy is suited for this region, and that ultimately a Nasser is preferable to something else. Well, I come from the Arab Spring generation, which says that that way of thinking should have been thrown in the bin. What are we, 13 years ago now? Unfortunately, seems to just have a new lease on life every time.
The idea of a just dictator is nothing but a fantasy, an illusion. It doesn't exist, and it's closer to fiction.
Al-Mustabid al-Adil, is that
exactly? Yeah. Or even a dictator al-Adil, the just dictator, which is a talking point that's actually always talked about on Egyptian media. But I'm not sure.
Abdel Nasser, there was an essay published in Foreign Affairs in 1955, I believe it was, under Gamal Abdel Nasser's name. Who actually wrote it, I'm not sure. Was it Hakel or was it him? We can assume he approved it at least, in which he explicitly makes this point, some basically says that, democracy in principle is desirable, but Egyptians are not yet ready for it. That same refrain, that's a colonial era one, was uttered by the big man himself.
Yeah, and also by Omar Suleiman during the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution, said that Egyptians are not ready for democracy. Democracy is a great idea, that's what he said, but when? That's what he said.
It's a great idea, just not for us, and not now. Yeah.
Exactly. All right, any closing remarks or something you'd like to bring up before we wrap up this episode? Any projects you're working on, future projects?
Like I said, I mean, I do have this other book that I'm beginning to work on. Like, I don't want to say too much about it just because I haven't got it approved by my agent, or it hasn't even reached the stage of a proposal or anything. I guess I could say, and this is something that had not been made public anywhere yet, actually, that I'm happy to report translation rights for the Arabic version of the book have been sold to a publisher in Beirut. They are currently, I think, trying to find a suitable translator, but in principle, at least, we should hopefully see the book come out in Arabic at some stage, hopefully sooner rather than later. So for those who prefer to read Arabic, that will be a happy day for me and hopefully for others.
Very exclusive news. Congratulations.
Oh, that's a big scoop. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was a very enjoyable conversation, and I'm a big fan of the podcast, and we'll look out for the episode and many others.
Of course. Thank you so much for coming on Tahrir Podcast, Rowell. I had a great time, and it was a great conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
المديرة رفض أجور إضافية، الصحفي كسب جايزة إعلامية، المهرج رقص ألوان الوطنية، المشروع القومي تسهيل المأدية، الأشول عسكري خطواته يمينية، مغفل بيرضع بزاز ديمقراطية، الأمم متحدة ضد العنصرية، للقنابل وجهة شرق أوسطية، النسر ختم لي بهجرة غير شرعية، الوزير زور بطاقة علاجية، الموظف سرق وزارة المالية، والسياسي يا عيني عالسياسي شاعر قهاوي راكع تحت السيدو، يشكن يكيف يرميله جنيه في ايده. سادتي أعزائي المجنونة صدق على حكم القاضي الكمينة بيحلل بول التعاطي، والملك كرشه من جيب النباتي، الوكيلة رفض طالب في الإعدادي، الوزارة خلفت جيل إنسان آلي، تعابين أكلت بيوتها من مكانها، أرانب هربت وشوهين عيالها، الأعور قدم طلب للتعافي، القاضي